I'm going to read to you a chapter of my novel, which I just wrote, called Right Back Where We Started From. It starts out in the California Gold Rush. It doesn't really stay there. It kind of moves into other eras of California history. It goes into World War II during San Francisco and the golden era of California movie making in the 30s, and then, you know, a cult. It kind of moves around a bit. And this particular chapter starts out the chronology of the book. So, you know, all the action in this chapter it happens after all the all the action of the book happens after all the action in this chapter. So the one thing you should know about this chapter is that it starts with a page from a medical book. So I'm going to read the page from the book and then pause and then go into the story. So it's going to be a page from the book, pause, story. So, okay, so this is excerpt of Medical Oddities and Other Horrors by Oliver Goldhammer, MD, PhD, copyright 1947, Walter J. Glaubt, Incorporated, Chapter 6, Lightning Curiosities, page 7. That this phenomenon may not exist. However, documented cases suggest it is merely underreported, perhaps because it is a phenomenon that the subject himself is unaware of, and therefore can only be witnessed by others. Ink and murals as far back as the 15th century give account of men who glowed azul before the finger of God knocked them down, suggesting ancient cases of disorder. More recently, in 1927, witnesses claimed that a New Jersey man named Alvin Ela turned periwinkle before his ties started zigging back and forth like a metronome. Then in 1941, an unnamed Indiana man not only turned cobalt blue, according to the Indiana Tribune, but his socks flew out of a laundry basket and into the garden, where they proceeded to cling to him. But even so, these incidents might be dismissed if it weren't for Vera Webb. Her case is unusual in that, unlike Ela or the Indiana man, the event occurred at a society ball in Portland, Maine in 1850. There was an extraordinary amount of coverage at the time, including an article on the front page of the Portland Heralder with the headline, "Young Lady Escapes an Electrical Storm Spectacle." Webb, unique among her fellow afflicted, is the only person to survive the phenomenon and tell about it. Indeed, she went on to marry, and her daughter, Mabel Sanborn, survives her. But it is a recorded fact that the Sanborn Ball was in the middle of thunderstorm season. While that might have been enough to cancel an ordinary party, the ball was much anticipated in Maine society. Not only was respected Judge Luke Sanborn announcing the engagement of his son, Mr. James Sanborn, to a Miss Melissa Fletcher, but for the last 6 months, Judge Sanborn had been converting the attic of his 3-story colonial home into a ballroom. When the guests arrived, they were directed up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd story, where a new ballroom spanned the entire length of the house. The maple floors gleamed, the garlands of chrysanthemums hung on the walls, and refreshments were laid out beside a barrel of Mrs. Sanborn's famous apple cider. On the end of the room, a small orchestra was setting up. On the other end, a balcony overlooked a field. Someone in reckless spirits had thrown open the balcony doors, and an energized breeze blew through the room. Every so often, lightning struck the field outside, and every time the guests exclaimed, "Ooh." Only Elmer Sanborn, James's cousin, remained unmoved by the scene before him. He had more important things to think about than the lightning. In less than a month, he was planning to leave for the California gold rush. His family was firmly against the plan and had pleaded with Elmer to give up what they saw as a dangerous and foolhardy journey. When that didn't work, they had insisted he come to the ball, hoping that a young lady would distract him from his plans. But they could never understand how dull the swirling dancers seemed to Elmer. Compared to visions of California, Maine society women were as colorless as wrens before his eyes. So as everyone danced, he stood by the wall with his hands behind his back, comparing the cost of the journeys to the riches he expected to make in California. Just this morning, the newspaper had said that a man could net over $1,500 in a single day at the gold rush. That was more than Elmer could earn as a yearly salary after a lifetime of working at his father's bank. And that was only one figure. It was possible to make 10 times that in a single day, as in the case of 3 Frenchmen who moved a stump on their land and found $15,000 in gold lying underneath it. In fact, some said a man could stroll down the American River and scoop gold nuggets right out of the water. Given this, Elmer couldn't see why every man at this ball wasn't leaving for California at this instant. Take his cousin James, whose engagement to Melissa Fletcher this ball was celebrating. All week, everyone was saying how James was going to be a great lawyer like his father someday, but Elmer could only pity him. James would spend every day of his life rearranging papers in an office, just like Elmer had been doing for the last few years at the bank. Elmer was escaping that life, yet James would willingly change himself to it by proposing to Melissa. To do something like that when there was a gold rush going on, Elmer couldn't fathom it. Currently, James was standing beside Melissa on the balcony. The one thing Elmer knew about Melissa, aside from her social reputation, was that she had a habit of patting the bottom of her ringlets so that they bounced upwards. Elmer had seen her do this twice, once while talking to another lady at an outdoor concert, and then a second time when in line for food at a church picnic. Both times, the gesture had struck Elmer as particularly vain. Now Melissa was talking to someone else, a woman. Who was that? Elmer could only see the side of her head. He strained forward, squinting through the dancers that separated him from the balcony until he recognized the girl. It was the piano player from church. Her name is Vera Webb. Here, Elmer tried to go back to thinking about the gold rush, but he kept trailing off to watch Vera. There was something arresting about her. It wasn't that she was prettier than the other girls. Elmer wouldn't have even noticed her if she didn't get up in front of the congregation to play hymns every Sunday. No, something else was drawing Elmer's attention to Vera as she stood on the balcony with the evening sky streaked purple and gray behind her. He blinked to clear his vision. Yes, it was still there. Vera Webb was glowing blue. Or it was not so much that Vera herself was blue as that the blue was sitting on top of her skin, encircling her face and neck and fading away into her clothing. It was a soft blue, the color of forget-me-nots, but it was noticeable enough that Elmer could see it from across the room. As if hypnotized, Elmer pushed through the crowd to get closer to Vera. The feet of the dancers pounded in the rhythm of the Virginia reel as another gust of breeze blasted the women's skirts. Elmer saw that the blue didn't just surround Vera's face and neck, but her entire body. It outlined her with a fuzzy radiance, reminding him of halos he'd seen in pictures of saints. She even looked a bit like a saint just then, smiling at Melissa Fletcher with her hands clasped in front of her. Then, as Elmer watched, one of Vera's blonde curls rose off her forehead and stood straight in the air, as if someone were holding it there. She was laughing, and the curl moved with her as she leaned forward and touched Melissa's arm with her icy blue hand. If nothing else, Elmer was a man of action. Without knowing why, he dove across the room and tackled Vera Webb, pushing her into the ballroom. The dancers stopped in one collective gasp of shock, but there was no time for outrage. As Vera's shoes cleared the balcony, there was a violent crack, like monstrous billiard balls slamming together. Lightning struck where Vera had been standing, hitting James Sanborn's balcony in a fierce stab, as red and hot as a fireplace poker. Flames began to lick the floor. Before anyone could stop him, James Sanborn grabbed the barrel of apple cider and emptied it onto the fire. It was the wrong thing to do. Smoke billowed everywhere as flames reacted to the alcohol and moved closer to the dancers. Women began to scream and faint all over the room. Everyone, to the stables, Luke Sanborn shouted. In a stampede of skirts and screams, the guests rushed to the stairs. But though the newly hewn door frame was wide enough for a man and his wife to enter the ballroom in grand style, it was not wide enough for a minister's wife and 2 portly widows to shove through at once. For one terrible moment, the women were stuck in the doorway like worms caught in the beak of a bird. Then someone shouted, "Heave, ho!" and the women burst into the hallway, their petticoats flying in all directions. While this was going on, Vera lay in Elmer's grasp in an apparent faint. Undaunted and actually rather enjoying himself, Elmer picked her up and carried her through the stampeding guests to the stables, where she regained consciousness in time to be laid in a carriage. For a moment, she met Elmer Sanborn's hazel eyes with her own, before he grinned and galloped off to help with the fire. "That's a very brave young man," said a friend, watching Vera closely. "Yes," Vera said. She might have said something else then, but as the word left her mouth, rain began to pour down in a torrent. The balcony was doused and smoke rose into the sky. People hurried to their carriages, their ball gowns slick like wet rose petals. The air was filled with the smell of burnt apples. As the women gathered around Vera, her blue eyes followed the men rushing to keep the weakening fire from spreading. Onlookers noted how she watched one man in particular as he darted through the rain. Some later said she caused the fire simply by standing where lightning could hit her.